Colonel, I'd like to start with the hot news of the day, which is the explosion of the Ukrainian dam. Obviously, there are many theories about what caused it, but let's watch the explosion and observe the water. We can actually talk over it. Can you tell where the explosion originated, Colonel? Well, it's difficult to be certain, but based on the emerging information, it appears that this happened within the dam structure. More specifically, it may be related to the electrical works inside. Whether this resulted from deliberate explosives or damage that occurred last year, no one knows. However, more people are concluding that neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians deliberately destroyed the dam. From a military standpoint, the concern for the Ukrainians at this point is that it complicates their operation significantly. The flooded areas, especially on the eastern side of the Dnieper, make it very difficult for their forces to maneuver through these muddy areas. It also renders an airborne or river-based assault almost impossible. The larger concern, though, is the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. How does this water affect the nuclear power plant? Just before I came on, my friend Chuck Spinney pointed out that there were concerns because we don't know if all the reactors are offline. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians tried to shut down most of the reactors, but we think one may still be operating. Water is used to cool the reactors. Will the drop in the water level in the river near Zaporizhzhia impact the availability of water? We don't know, but that's a valid concern. A nuclear accident, of course, would be catastrophic. What do Ukrainians use for ordinary power in businesses and homes? Well, they have. Of course, once the war began and the Russians gained control, they largely shut it down to prevent it from running out of control. What body of water is all this spillage coming from? It's the river. The Soviets flooded the area to harness it for power, ultimately building a nuclear power plant that provided important power for the entire state of Ukraine. However, right now, it's minimal, if at all. So, our concern is not to run out of water used to cool any operational reactors. I'm fascinated by your conclusion, from your own observations and sources, that this is more likely an explosion from within the dam and not intentional. Yeah, my rather naive, or at least legal, perspective was cui bono, to whose benefit? Initially, I thought the Ukrainians blew up their own dam to flood the lands and hinder the Russians. I'm glad you corrected me. Has anybody claimed responsibility for this? No. There's been a lot of finger-pointing. The Ukrainians blame everything on the Russians. If the sun comes up 2 minutes late tomorrow morning, the Russians are blamed. But the Russians didn't do it, it's evident. There was no incentive for them to do it. They could have done it months ago if they wanted. I don't think the Ukrainians wanted this either because it's clear they've assembled amphibious forces for potential use behind the Russian defensive lines, which is now impractical due to the flooding. If there's accidental benefit, one could argue that the Russians somewhat benefit simply because instead of a 900-mile defensive line, they're now dealing with around 870 to 875 miles because some areas are too muddy and flooded for anyone to get through. Regarding the explosion, if someone assumed that the offensive had begun, the contrary is true. The flooding likely impeded the imminence of the spring offensive. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption. And if we discuss the offensive for a moment. Sure. Over the weekend, there were 3 major attacks along this 900-mile front, the largest being near Zaporizhzhia. These attacks were disastrous for the Ukrainians. They lost almost 4,000 men, including those killed and wounded, as well as significant military equipment. In comparison, the Russians had significantly fewer casualties and retained their defensive lines. This just confirms what we've been saying from the start. The Ukrainian defense is strong and any attempt to attack it results in massive losses. So, the question remains, if these were just probing attacks and a larger offensive is yet to come, what form will it take? Right. Colonel, is Ukraine falling apart? Yes, absolutely. Morale is at rock bottom. It's very tragic. The military leadership knows it and is frantic. The concern isn't so much what happens after the so-called counteroffensive fails, but whether Ukraine has anything left at all by that point. If the Russians move, and I suspect they will, they'll likely overrun most of the areas east of the Dnieper and eventually move south to Odessa. Here's a video prepared by the Ukrainian government. Now, I know we're going to talk about D-Day in a few minutes. Yeah. Somehow, I can't imagine Eisenhower having done this, but here's a video prepared by the Ukrainian government, sort of announcing and warning. Please, Colonel, pay careful attention to the very end, which is different from the first 3/4 of this. Okay. Plan like silence, there will be no announcement that it has started. There you go. What were those jets at the end, Colonel? I don't know. I didn't recognize them, frankly. You didn't recognize them as American F-16s. I'm not saying they are. It's very different from the rest, and it would seem to implicate that the spring offensive, in quotes, yeah, it's going to be an invasion of Russia. Well, I suppose we could add our aircraft to their arsenal, but then you're running the risk of being at war with Russia, which I don't think even this administration, at this stage, wants to risk. I'm sure there are Ukrainian commanders in the field that are asking where those troops are and why they can't have them. Why they're in front of cameras with their fingers on their lips. I mean, what is this, if anything? It's inconceivable to me what they expected to accomplish, other than to send a message that somehow or another they're more ready and capable than they are. I mean, those people were all beautifully uniformed. None of them looked like they'd been in combat for any length of time. They were all extremely well fed. Normally, if you've been in combat for any length of time, you've lost weight, your uniform is worn out. You don't look pristine for the camera by any stretch of the imagination. Even the small arms that were depicted there and the equipment were brand new, clean equipment. You know, so maybe these are obviously not part of the equipment that included 54 tanks destroyed, including some unknown number of Leopard tanks, by the way. They were part of the assault that were destroyed. Colonel, is the Russian army having difficulty gaining control of even the areas of Ukraine that President Putin and the Russian Federation have claimed for years are legally parts of Russia? No, I haven't seen any evidence for that. I mean, the areas they've claimed that incorporated are under control. There are no fifth columnists blowing things up now. They have been penetrated, as we've discussed before. I think the SAS was responsible for the attack on the bridge to Crimea. They may have done some other things, but no, I don't see the SAS as British. Yeah, the British Special Air Service. That's the equivalent of what we would call Special Operations Forces, and they're very, very good. There's no question about it, and it's very risky to send them behind the lines like that, but they appear to have done it. They may have had a hand, by the way, in the recent drone attacks on Moscow. Can the attacks on Russia inside Russia alter the course of this conflict? No, absolutely not. I mean, you're talking about pinpricks. You know, these are just because you managed to get off a lucky shot and kill one person. Is it going to change the outcome if you're fighting an entire company of infantry? Well, the same analogy for, you're fighting Russia. If anything, it reinforces and reaffirms in the minds of the Russian people the criticality of getting on with this thing and crushing the Ukrainians. I mean, as I've said before, President Putin is the one who's exercised enormous restraint. It would be very easy for him to go before the camera and emote about what had happened and how it threatened the motherland and so forth and justify massive attacks on Ukraine. He didn't do that. He essentially dismissed them and then pointed out that they would continue their strikes in the future. Al Jazeera is reporting, but we don't have the actual clip of this or we'd run it. Here's the English translation of what they're reporting. I'm going to suggest that this could have been written by Victoria Nuland, but it came out of the mouth of President Zelensky. Quote, the destruction of the dam confirms that Russian forces must be expelled from every corner of Ukrainian land. That, of course, is, I would think, fanciful, impossible, even inconceivable if he's including Crimea. Yeah, I think it was Matthew McConaughey who, in a recent film, was talking about Fugazi. He was describing people that are trying to predict what happens in the marketplace with stocks and bonds and so forth. He just says, it's all Fugazi. 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 Forget it. You can't predict anything. You don't know what's going to happen. Don't worry about it. The point is to move the client's money from his pocket into yours. Well, I think that describes Zelensky brilliantly. Lots of fugazi, police and more money. None of it's going to work. So, it's ridiculous. Gary, can you run the clip, please, of Secretary of State Lincoln? Colonel, this is Secretary of State Lincoln, last weekend in Helsinki. As I've made clear by virtually every measure, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a strategic yet. While Putin has failed to achieve his aims, he hasn't given up on them. He's convinced that he can simply outlast Ukraine and his supporters, sending more and more Russians to their deaths, inflicting more and more suffering on Ukraine civilians. He thinks that even if he loses the short game, he can still win the long game. Putin is wrong about this too. The United States, together with our partners, is firmly committed to supporting Ukraine's defense today, tomorrow, for as long as it takes. So, President Zelensky called President Putin a cornered animal. I would argue that Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin have painted themselves into a corner with this nonsense about as long as it takes. I mean, should a war end by a ceasefire now, or a ceasefire a year from now after 100,000 more humans are dead and 100 billion more American dollars have been? Well, my first inclination is to suggest that Blinken's middle name is Fugazi. But then there's a second point that needs to be made, and that is this inhumanity towards Ukrainian people. It's inconceivable to me. This is the thing with which I've had great difficulty from day one. Obviously, nobody gives a damn what happens inside Ukraine to the human beings living there. And that's nonsense. That is the antithesis of everything we say we represent as Americans. So they should be ashamed of themselves. As far as coming to a conclusion here. Look. He talks about outlasting. Putin thinks he can outlast this. Judge, he's already done that. Take a long, good look at Germany. Germany has slid into a very deep recession. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Cheap energy is the lifeblood of scientific industrial power and economies. Germany is being industrialized by their own leadership. Just yesterday, I watched a speech that Schultz arrived to give. He couldn't give it. He was booed off the stage. H.M. People yelled at him and screamed at him. He kept saying, "We are fighting Putin. We have to fight Putin." And people just said nonsense. Who forget it? The Germans never believed that the so-called Russians were coming. Nobody in Europe and Western Europe believed that. This is nonsense that we've spun out of it. I go back again, if you're going to say that the Russians were incompetent and incapable, then how can they simultaneously be bent on conquering Eastern Europe and Central Europe? It's a lot of nonsense. The whole game is almost up in the West. And I think Germany will be the bellwether. At first, I thought it would be France, but now I'm beginning to think it'll be Germany. I don't see how this Schultz government can last. Is the West tiring of the war? Oh, absolutely. Except for the Biden administration. Well, I don't think that this is an enormous burden for anybody sitting in the U.S. Senate. I mean, I don't see them losing any sleep over how many people die in Ukraine or how much money is wasted on this proposition. But then again, we just saw them sign up for another enormous debt ceiling and continue to pretend that debt doesn't matter. I think we all know that's going to end badly for the United States and the West. So, these are just irresponsible human beings in charge in Washington. The question is what we Americans are going to do when the whole thing implodes. And I think it's coming. How significant in World War II was what was set in motion on June 6, 1944, D-Day? Well, Americans are routinely treated to these horrific numbers, which were horrific, involving Soviet losses during the Second War. When I was in Moscow in 2001 at the General Staff Academy, the historian there briefed me personally because I asked him, and told me that they had counted 39,900,000 dead, including more than 15 million Soviet soldiers. And he said, we're still counting. The Russians have since changed their numbers. They moved them to 26 million. I think they've now moved it up to 32 million. The truth is it was at least 39 million dead. And we're presented this as evidence for victory. Well, that's not what sealed Germany's fate, contrary to popular belief. We provided something under the so-called Lend-Lease program, thanks to Franklin D. Roosevelt, that provided enormous quantities of equipment. And if you put that light up, Americans can see this. This is from Albert Week's book Russia's Lifesaver Lend-Lease. And look at all the material that we provided: railroad equipment, trucks, wheel transport. When the Germans were fighting the Soviets in Stalingrad in November of 1942, they found all of the Soviet troops riding on American wheeled trucks and jeeps. And when the Soviets made films of Stalingrad, they cut out every photograph that showed anything from the United States. Colonel, did we sell this? Did we lend it or did we give it to the Soviets? FDR gifted everything, which in today's numbers would be hundreds of billions of dollars. The Soviets were never asked to repay a dime. You say FDR. You didn't say the Congress? No, FDR acted on his own. There was no bill passed at the time authorizing FDR to ship anything he wanted to the Soviet Union. In fact, in 1941 in July, the meeting was held in Moscow with Stalin by Harry Hopkins, and when that meeting was held, it was held by Harry Hopkins only. The U.S. ambassador and the U.S. defense attaché were excluded from the meeting, and during that meeting, the entire Lend-Lease program was set up. Stalin provided a list of what he needed. For instance, you saw on that chart petroleum. We shipped so much petroleum, that is oil, to Russia during the Second World War that the Russians actually resold great quantities of it to the Japanese against whom we were fighting. How did we get petroleum from the North Atlantic to Russia during World War II? Well, it actually went across the Pacific under the Russian flag, and because it was under the Russian flag, the Japanese didn't sink it. So, it was delivered largely to a lot of Vostok. See, this is the bizarre history of the Second World War. And, you know, we helped the British as well, and we charged them for everything, and they were effectively bankrupted by the Second World War. And FDR wanted to do that because he was determined to destroy the British Empire. He actually said that he thought the British Empire was evil, but that Stalin's state was not. Oh my goodness! I guess he never said that to his second cousin Winston Churchill. Well, Churchill wasn't much help. No. Because Churchill never objected, and Churchill ran his country into the ground. I think a whole new story about the Second World War needs to reach the public. They need to know what the truth is. My only statement, the reason I'm concerned about this, Stalin begged us repeatedly to attack in the West. He wanted us to attract 80 divisions of the German armed forces to fight in the West. When we landed at Normandy, the Germans had 40 divisions there, and eventually it rose to higher numbers, 60, 70 divisions. Of course, they were all grossly under strength. Instead of $12,000 or $13,000, there were only 5,000 Germans in these, but nevertheless, the Normandy invasion was critical to the Soviets because once we came ashore, we did draw off most of the best forces that were readily available to fight the Soviets in Poland. Right. And your historians will remember that in June of 1944 and on the 22nd, the Soviets attacked in Operation Migration. And that attack reached all the way to Warsaw and effectively liberated all of White Russia and took into the Baltic littoral and right up to the Carpathian Mountains. In other words, it advanced Soviet national interests, but it didn't help us at Normandy, but we certainly helped them, and we haven't even talked about the bombing campaign. We lost 18,000 heavy bombers. We and the Royal Air Force penetrating German air defenses, and those bombers did something for the Soviets that no one else could have done. We destroyed the petroleum industry in Germany. We stopped a shipment of oil. By the time the Russians attacked in June of 1944, the average German aircraft had about 2 hours of flight time with fuel, after which it crashed. So one can argue about who won the war. The point that needs to be kept in mind is without us, without our bombing campaign, I don't think the Soviets would have ever reached Minsk in White Russia.